Welcome to Educate, Inform, and Challenge. My name is Teresa MacLennan, Executive Director of the Women and Children's Shelter of Barrie. We're so glad that you've joined us today. As you know, the goal of our show is to talk about, of course, the lives and experiences of women, women in leadership and gender equity, human trafficking. And of course, we'd like to talk to community partners and other agencies that are doing valuable work in our community, providing valuable services to all of us. And so today I'm really looking forward to the conversation that we're going to have. And I will introduce my fabulous guest in 1 minute. But I do want to first acknowledge and thank our Indigenous community. Thank you for allowing us to have these conversations on these lands. We thank you. So today we're going to be talking about something that I think is, for any of us has crossed our minds from one time or another. And it's a sensitive topic. And so for our viewers, if there's anything that is difficult for you to hear today or it's triggering for you, please just take a step back. We want you to be well. Our goal is to educate, inform, and challenge our thinking. And so we hope that we're going to do that for all of us today. I am really pleased to welcome my guest, Kelsey Goforth, who is the Director of Programs from Dying with Dignity Canada. So welcome, Kelsey. So lovely to have you with us today.
Thank you for inviting me. Happy to be here.
Thank you. So let's just dive right in because there is so much that we could talk about and unpack here. So let's start off with what is the mandate and the goal of Dying with Dignity Canada?
So as an organization, we have three main areas in which we work: education, advocacy, and support. And through those three areas, our mission is to ensure access to quality end-of-life choice and care. We aim to defend human rights by advocating for assisted dying rules that are aligned with the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms and the Constitution. We educate people about their legal end-of-life options, and we support people, their families, and their healthcare providers as they navigate those options.
So that's a very big umbrella in terms of the work that you're doing and providing this support. And so what are maybe some of the misconceptions that we may have about dying with dignity and making that decision? What are some of the misconceptions?
Well, one misconception we often hear is about our organization itself and what we do, and there is some confusion about what our role is and what it is not. So we're a charitable organization, and one of the misconceptions is that we oversee MAID in some way, but we're not that oversight body. We didn't write the assisted dying law, and we don't have the ability to approve or deny people for MAID. That's handled by nurse practitioners and doctors and their provincial and territorial MAID teams who coordinate those requests. But from the perspective of misconceptions about medical assistance in dying and what that looks like, there's certainly many, and some have been apparent since the beginning of assisted dying legislation back in 2016. And one that we've heard is that there has to be a terminal illness to qualify for MAID, and that's never been a requirement since the beginning, and it certainly isn't now. There are a couple different options for eligibility for MAID, 2 different tracks that people can be on, but neither one of them requires a terminal diagnosis to move forward.
Okay, so maybe let's try to unpack it, and even if you can, I know it's going to be large, but what does the legislation currently say about MAID?
Yeah, so the current eligibility requirements specify that a person needs to be eligible for health services funded by the federal government or by a province or territory. So that means that visitors to Canada are generally not permitted to access MAID, and that you usually need to be a Canadian citizen or a permanent resident to move forward. A person must also be 18 years of age or older, and they need to have decision-making capacity. Their request for MAID needs to be voluntary, and there needs to be informed consent when they're making those decisions. They also need to have a grievous and irremediable medical condition, meaning that they have a serious illness, disease, or disability, that they're in an advanced state of decline that cannot be reversed, and that they're experiencing unbearable physical or mental suffering.
So how has Bill C7 impacted MAID and the rights of people who are looking for assistance with dying?
Mhm. So before Bill C-7, there was a requirement that one's death needed to be reasonably foreseeable. This meant that the person's death was reasonably predictable and that something had happened to put the person on a trajectory towards death. So as I mentioned, it never meant terminal. However, it did leave out a number of individuals who were suffering. So what we found a few years into the legislation was a court case. This was in 2019. And we had two individuals in Quebec, Jean Truchon and Nicole Gladue, and they both suffered from incurable degenerative diseases, but they didn't qualify for MAID under the original eligibility criteria. So they went to court and they fought successfully to have those laws changed. They argued that that reasonably foreseeable natural death requirement that was in the criminal code was unconstitutional, overly strict, and prevented access to MAID for some people who met all the other criteria in the law. So what moved forward then was the Quebec Superior Court agreed with them, and the government opted not to challenge that decision to the Supreme Court. And as a result, in 2021, we had Bill C-7 come into effect to align with that Truchon decision. So what this meant for people is that Bill C-7 came into effect and introduced a second track for MAID. So track 1 is for people whose death is reasonably foreseeable. Track 2, that new track, is for those whose deaths are not reasonably foreseeable. So people can qualify under either of those tracks, but the safeguards are going to look different depending on which track a person is on. We do have some statistics on how that's going so far, and the statistics that are the most recent are from 2021, and this is from a Health Canada report. So in it, it said that 2.2% of people who accessed MAID in that year were considered track 2, so a very small number. And the average age of those individuals was just over 70 years old. So that was one change, but there were a couple other changes that came out of C-7 as well that have had large impacts on people. The other is the allowance of a waiver of final consent. And this is available for those who are considered track 1. And what this means, it's also referred to as Audrey's Amendment, and it refers to a woman named Audrey Parker. She lived in Nova Scotia. Back in 2018, she had breast cancer that moved to her brain, and she wanted to spend a final Christmas with her family before accessing MAID. Because though she was afraid of capacity loss, she decided to move forward with MAID in early November instead of trying to wait through the holiday season. So she didn't have the option of a waiver, but now we do. And what this means and how it's used is that a patient and a MAID provider come into a written agreement together where they set a date for MAID, and that waiver allows the MAID provider to go ahead with MAID, even if the person loses their ability to provide final consent. So that's a big change. It's provided a lot of comfort to individuals who, similar to Audrey Parker, have that fear of capacity loss. One final aspect of C-7 to discuss is MAID and mental disorders. So while Bill C-7 was being debated, the Senate put forward an amendment which was adopted to allow those whose sole underlying condition was a mental illness to be able to access MAID, and that amendment was also passed. So the rationale for this was that those who have a mental illness should not be discriminated against based on their diagnosis, and that mental suffering is no less tolerable than physical suffering. And this change in the law was placed in the sunset clause, which was originally set to expire on March 17th of this year, 2023. However, an extension was recently requested, and that date has now changed to March 17th, 2024.
So I think it's a very interesting conversation too about where does mental health fit into MAID, because I was listening to a gentleman speak on CBC radio the other day who was asking for assisted death, and for whatever the holdups are in the process has not been able to get it, but has been on this journey for maybe about 7 years wanting to do that. And it was so fascinating to listen to him and his story. He's very articulate. He's very common sense approach to he's done with the struggle of his mental health. And one of the questions that the interviewer asked was, well, but is there a potential that you're going to get better? And so I think that the previous things that you were talking about in terms of, yes, there is in some situations for people, there's going to be no hope of getting better. In some people, perhaps there could be, but there's still factors that they would be eligible for MAID. Am I clarifying that right in terms of how mental wellness would fit into those streams?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think, we don't have the law yet. We'll see what happens next year, but what we're likely going to see is a very small number of individuals fitting into that criteria. People who have many, many years, if not decades of suffering, who have tried multiple treatments and medications and therapies, and nothing seems to be improving their situation. There has been a lot of work done to determine exactly what the assessment process should look like for individuals moving through MAID on the basis of a mental disorder. And an expert panel has explored that thoroughly, and there's recommendations that are being considered as well. So certainly more to come on that front, but plenty of work being done to prepare for next year.
Yeah. It's an incredible service that you provide, and I cannot imagine the spectrum of questions that and phone calls that you are taking in terms of folks who have questions about this. And we are going to be heading into a commercial break soon, but I think in light of we're talking about mental wellness, but the incidence of cancer and just these chronic diseases increasing, and I think much more of a focus of folks wanting to take control of their own decision-making about their end-of-life plan. Have you seen an increase in the amount of folks who are reaching out to your agency wanting some support and some guidance and to talk about this?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. We have seen a large number of people curious about a number of different areas of end-of-life. We do receive a lot of inquiries about MAID, of course, although another key area that people want to know about is advanced care planning. And through this process, a person can specify their medical wishes, their personal values, and share those with their substitute decision maker. So what would they want or not want if they're in a state when they don't have the capacity to make their own healthcare decisions? So we provide a lot of information about that. We have tools specific to each province and territory that people can use and have those discussions with people. And regarding MAID, generally our questions fall into two categories. What does the law mean? It has changed. It's not always easy to understand. And how do I find a clinician to assist me, potentially, if I do qualify? So we have several resources available to break down the various aspects of the law and clarify those misconceptions. And also when it comes to finding a clinician, as mentioned earlier, we're not the MAID assessor network. There's those provincial and territorial care coordination services that exist. So we do provide the contact information for people who would like to see about their own eligibility and meet with those assessors.
Okay, and so we're going to head into a very short commercial break, and I'm really looking forward to diving back into this conversation, Kelsey, as a means to inform and educate our community, and maybe we'll walk through those steps as someone who calls you, then what happens. So for our viewers, please stay with us as we continue our really insightful conversation with Kelsey from Dying with Dignity Canada. So stay with us and we'll be right back.
This program is brought to you by Ignite TV. Now you're in command. Visit Rogers.com for more details.
These days at your local Legion, we're marching to the beat of a different drum. On a mission to support veterans, to have fun, and to welcome everyone to our ranks. You don't have to be a veteran to join the Legion. And as a member, you'll join thousands of others serving our veterans, our communities, and our country. Oh yeah, and our Member Perks program will save you thousands on shopping, dining, products, and services across the country. Join us at legion.ca.
Focus better.
Partner better.
Sleep better.
Breathe better.
Love better. Work better. Friend better. Unwind better.
Everything gets better when you get active.
Welcome back to Educate, Inform, and Challenge. Again, I'm Teresa MacLennan from the Women and Children's Shelter of Barrie. We're having a very insightful conversation today with Kelsey Goforth, who is the Director of Programs from Dying with Dignity Canada. And again, we're talking about some sensitive information, and we're hoping that it's going to be educational, informative for our viewers. And certainly, if you have more questions or you would like to, just sort of do your own research, check out the Dying with Dignity Canada website. There's a lot of great information on there that answers maybe some of those questions that you have. And I believe from our conversation with Kelsey is that they are very resourceful and good people to talk to if you have any questions. So we're going to just pick up our conversation here, Kelsey, and wanted to ask you about where does dementia fit into MAID and kind of end of life planning decisions?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it is a major myth that we hear about dementia in relation to MAID. Some people feel as though having a dementia diagnosis will automatically mean that a person doesn't qualify for MAID. But that's not the case, as many people with dementia in its earlier stages continue to have decision-making capacity when it comes to healthcare. What is required under the law is that the person themselves has capacity during the assessment process. So at this point in time, we have no option for powers of attorney or substitute decision makers or anybody else to decide that a person is going to have MAID. It has to be that person leading that themselves and being fully capable during those assessment processes. So it is, I think the biggest myth there is that dementia automatically means that it can't happen, but there are certainly individuals with a dementia diagnosis who moved forward early enough in their disease trajectory who were able to access MAID.
Yeah. Do you ever hope for the future that considering like power of attorney decision making will come into play in terms of MAID? Is there a role there for that?
Mm-hmm. This is a major conversation. Our supporter base of individuals across the country are extremely passionate about this issue, and through a polling, the support is in its 80s for individuals wanting this to be a legal option for them. And what we refer to this as are advanced requests. So the ability to say ahead of time when you do have capacity, when you would want MAID in a future state when you don't have capacity. It is something that's being considered legislatively. And there was recently a report from the Special Joint Committee studying issues related to MAID that put forth that recommendation. So it's something to watch over the coming months and to see if this is something that may become a legal option for Canadians.
Yeah, because I think about how many of us in just day-to-day conversations with a spouse or partner, whoever, family members, maybe having those conversations of saying, if this happens to me, this is what I want. And there can be full knowledge that people have in our families about what it may look like for what I decide for my own life, my own body. But having some kind of legislative piece to support that, I could see how that would be pretty beneficial for folks. Because I do believe that those conversations happen, especially even as you're getting older. I know for myself, having conversations about what end of life, what I would want that to look like for myself, right? So it's just very interesting. There's a lot of what ifs. And I guess the good part is that we want conversation. We want to generate people talking and voicing their thoughts. And if people are asking the question, it means that we need to figure out the answers.
Yeah, absolutely. And people are wanting to have those conversations, I think, more than ever. And we have so many individuals coming forward looking to fill out documents like advanced care planning kits so that they can be having those reflective conversations with themselves to figure out what they might want or not want, but also with their family members or whoever it is that they decide to be in charge of making those decisions for them.
Yeah. So let's kind of walk through the process. I'm going to use myself as an example. And so let's say I am someone who has been diagnosed with a terminal illness, and the prospect for me to live is not going to happen. And what I foresee is that the progression of my disease is only continue to worsen, and it's not something how I want to define my end of life. So I reach out to you and tell you, so this is my situation. Where do I start, and what are the options available to me?
Mm-hmm. So if a person's interested in the MAID process, the best contact in Ontario is the Care Coordination Service. It's run by the Ministry of Health. And from there, they would do initial intake to understand what the individual is going through, basic information like, location, OHIP number, those sorts of things. And from there, they'd connect the individual with MAID assessors in their area. So those are doctors or nurse practitioners who are available in the community to move through the assessment process with the individual. So that's typically the place where an individual would start. People do have the option to talk to their own clinician, their primary care provider. Not all of them are involved with MAID, so often there is a referral that happens anyway, and this Care Coordination Service is available to call without that initial referral.
So there's very specifically trained group of qualified people that are able to walk folks through this process, but also then to move ahead with that medically assisted death.
So the clinicians, the nurse practitioners and physicians involved in this work, many of them have been doing it since the very beginning, back in 2016 when it became an option. There's a very involved network of the clinicians across the country doing MAID assessments and provisions who support each other through that work. And currently there is a training being developed with Health Canada funding with various different modules to spread that education further to new clinicians or existing ones who want some additional information.
So in the assessment that they would originally do, are there safeguards to ensure that, the wrong support or the wrong decision isn't being made? Like, talk to us about some of those safeguards.
Yeah, absolutely. There's numerous safeguards in the legislation in the federal MAID law. One is that a written request needs to be completed and signed by the patient. If the patient can't sign for whatever reason, a proxy can sign on their behalf, but that patient has to be the one to consent to the form being signed. And it does need to be witnessed by an independent witness who has to meet a number of criteria, including not benefiting from the person's death in any way. 2 assessors have to be involved in the person's case, who are either nurse practitioners or physicians. And when the person's natural death isn't reasonably foreseeable, another person might be consulted if neither of those assessors have expertise in the condition causing the person's suffering. So another nurse practitioner or physician might be called in for those more complicated cases. Other safeguards written into the law are that people accessing MAID can change their mind at any time, and they must provide final consent unless that waiver of final consent that I mentioned earlier has been filled out. And for those who are track 2, whose natural death isn't reasonably foreseeable, there's additional safeguards in place, such as an assessment period of a minimum of 90 days. It often is much longer than 90 days, but the legal requirement is at least 90. And those individuals need to be informed of available and appropriate means of relieving their suffering, and they have to give serious consideration to those alternate means.
Do you receive phone calls from family members who they have a family member who is considering MAID, and the families themselves are struggling with, just the process of decision making, maybe holding on to hope, those sorts of things, right? Do you receive phone calls from families asking questions?
Yeah, absolutely. People do have questions. There's a lot of misconceptions about MAID and what it looks like. And on top of that, people are grieving. That grief might be anticipatory, knowing that their loved one may die soon, whether that's with MAID or without. So we are happy to clarify any areas of the law that people want to know more about. It's important to note too that ultimately that decision to have made is the patient's and the clinicians if the patient meets the criteria. That said, we're happy to have conversations with family members who just want that information and want to know more. And there are some really great organizations as well that work nationally who are able to support family members with the emotional side of things as well.
Yeah. Would you ever see someone who is, let's say, in hospice, who has also decided, to have their plan and to use MAID? Do those things happen, or does that usually not happen, that someone may be in hospice, but they might just decide before they get to that point to be at home and make that decision?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, individuals in various facilities decide that they might want MAID, and whether or not they can have it in those facilities is another question. We do have an issue across the country with what we call forced transfers. So those are situations where an individual is in a facility, whether it's a hospice, hospital, long-term care home, any number of places, and that facility doesn't allow MAID to happen on site. Our view as an organization is that if you're receiving public funds, that you should be allowing public healthcare to take place within those walls. And we've heard some very terrible traumatic stories of individuals being forced out of the place where they're living at the time, whether it's a living situation like a long-term care home where they maybe have been there for many years, or a place where it might have been a shorter period of time, but they're still feeling at home there and want to die there, but unfortunately face some barriers in doing so.
What are just some things that you really want folks to take away from your agency and our conversation today?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for the opportunity. I think the biggest thing to stress is just the importance of conversation, and that doesn't mean MAID, that doesn't mean any one end of life option over another, but what it does mean is ensuring that you're checking in with yourself about what those values are, what those beliefs are, what's important to you at the end of life, and thinking about it now. It's really never too early to have those thoughts and those conversations with those closest to you, including your healthcare team, so that they're aware of what you might want or not want in the event of a medical emergency or a situation that might happen sooner than expected. And using tools that are available. We have advanced care planning kits that are downloadable for free. And if you want to check them out, that's certainly one tool of many that you could utilize to get that conversation going and get things in place. It truly is never too early to start documenting what you might want when the time comes.
Yeah, thank you, Kelsey. And I'm very appreciative of the conversation. I mean, it's got a lot of layers, and it can, bring up more questions than perhaps there are answers. But for some people who are at this point in their lives, MAID can be a very viable decision for folks in how they choose to live and how they choose to die. And I'm always very thankful to have these conversations just so we can open up the dialogue, like you say, and conversation in our community. And so thank you again for being here, Kelsey. I really value our conversation, and thank you, our community, for being with us. We hope to see you again next time on Educate, Inform, Challenge. Take good care of yourselves. Bye-bye.